Welcome to For Heaven's Sake. Here's your host, Father Miles Riley.
Welcome indeed. The full title is What on Earth Are You Doing, for Heaven's Sake? And I am honored to share with you a man who has done a great deal for heaven's sake, for God's sake, and for all our sakes, the civil rights movement. He refers to it in his most recent book, An Easy Burden, by Andrew Young, as saving the soul of America. You are welcome.
Very good.
I have admired you for years. I thought, do I call you Ambassador Young?
Why don't we just make it Andy?
Andy, I love it.
Okay, fine.
I was going to, if I had to pick Mayor Young of Atlanta, 2 terms, or Congressman Young, or Ambassador Young to the UN, I was going to opt for Reverend.
That's fine.
Because you were ordained United Church of Christ,
That's
congregational
right.
minister.
And really, I've thought of everything that I've done as a part of my ministry. I liken my ministry to the Apostle Paul, who didn't have a church, but who wandered around doing good in various places. And I actually thought of the Congress as my parish, and the United Nations with 163 countries that were sort of nice-sized congregation. And then Atlanta with 2 million, you know, where you had taxing powers. So
That's like tithing?
That's right.
No second collections in this congregation. What, in what way was it? Do you see it as ministry?
Well, I think I always felt that our challenge in the South was from the book of Ephesians, to break down the dividing walls of hostility that separated. In Ephesians, it was Jew and Greek. In my lifetime, it was black and white, and rich and poor. And a ministry of reconciliation, bringing God's children together, is really what the civil rights movement was all about. And it's what any good ministry is all about.
Amen. Healing, hope. Are we not the first country, the first culture in recorded history to make a concerted effort to eliminate racism?
I think so.
I mean, we should brag on us a little bit.
Well, that's true.
And what you all have done.
And you know, I got in trouble at the United Nations for giving us credit for taking it on. And I think that we've come a long, long way. Notwithstanding that there's still some executives in Texaco that didn't get the message. But the truth of it is, 30 years ago when we started, that would have been the rule rather than the exception in the boardrooms. And now it's an exception, and they will probably pay damages for it. So that's a significant change as far as I'm concerned.
I'm just, every nation, every people, there's something deep, some deep sin, we Christians call it, Jews as well, that original sin, the Garden of Eden. There's some fatal flaw inside us that makes us want to put somebody else down.
And I think it's because we are reluctant to see God in somebody who's different. And yet, you know, our Constitution says that we're endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. And in a sense, that's the mandate politically. Religiously, I think we're all made in the image of God. And somehow we've got to have a community, a state or a nation, that reflects the fact that we're all, well, of one blood. God has made all the nations of the earth.
They're now doing these new DNA studies and suggesting that all of the creatures on this planet came from Africa. There are more differences among the Africans than there are between all the other peoples and cultures in the world, and maybe Africa was the garden.
Well, certainly the oldest recorded indications of man are in the Rift Valley in Kenya. And I trace civilization from the Rift Valley down the Nile Valley and then on to Europe and Asia, across North Africa. Some of us came and then were brought here as slaves. But regardless of where we came from, the differences within any group are greater than the differences between groups. And I was fortunate to grow up in a neighborhood in New Orleans, good Catholic neighborhood. But all of my friends were Irish, Italian, Polish, German, Cajun, Creole, Black. And we had to learn to get along. My parents told me that I was different, that in our country race was a burden, but it was an easy burden if you take it on one day at a time. And don't get angry and upset or emotional about it. And if other people don't like you or don't understand or think of you as inferior, don't get emotional and act inferior. Think your way through. And my daddy used to say, if you get angry in a fight, you lose the fight. And you have to keep your cool and think your way through difficulties. And they also said that...
Didn't Dad say, don't get mad, get smart?
Don't get mad, get smart.
Yeah.
And it's the only way to relate to other people, is not to get upset at their weaknesses, but to try to help them overcome them.
On a personal note, I have to ask this as I sit here looking at you in person for the first time, having watched you on newsreels and in marches all over our country as I was a young priest. I was always more comfortable with you than so many others in the civil rights movement. Was it because, I know this is a personal question, because you look more like I look, or because you sound more like I sound, or because you have a gentler way? Is it because you're a congregational minister and not a Baptist preacher?
Well, it might be all of it. But I think also it was this teaching by my parents that to be non-threatening. See, I grew up in this neighborhood, and right on the corner of my house was the German-American Bund. So as a 3- and 4-year-old, I'd walk by there and hear people hailing Hitler. And there was talk about a master race. And I was an inquisitive kid, and I asked all kinds of questions, and my parents had to explain it to me. And they had to explain Nazism as a kind of a sickness. You don't get mad at sick people, you try to help them. And it was teaching me that race was something that I couldn't run from or deny. I had to deal with it. And it was not something to get upset about, something to be very proud that God had made me this way. And there were enough little difficulties in a southern neighborhood to give me a lot of practice in dealing with people who were different.
Yeah.
And putting them at ease. With Martin Luther King, I was in the position of almost always being, after he went to jail, I would be in the one that ended up having to relate to the sheriffs and to the racists around. And I remember one time in Albany, Georgia, I went to see Martin and Ralph, who were in jail, and the big burly sheriff's deputy or police sergeant looked up and saw me. I said, "I'm here to see Dr. King." And he didn't even look up. He turned and he said, "There's a little nigger out here that came to see those big niggers back there. What do I do about it?" And I said, "Oh my God." He was too big for me to hit. And he had a stick and a gun, and he was the law, and I was the agitator from outside. And I had to go by there 2 times a day for the next, I didn't know how long. The next time I went in, well, I noticed his name. And before he looked up, I said, "Good morning, Sergeant Hamilton. How you doing today?" And calling him by name, he said, "Okay."
Humanized.
Yeah, and I said, "How's it going?" And I made him talk. I made him talk about his family. I made him talk about the weather. I made him talk. He was University of Georgia football player. I made him talk about the Georgia Bulldogs. And I put him at ease. Now, that was basically so I could get in and out of there to see Martin Luther King without getting myself thrown in jail or beat up. But you end up realizing that a righteous indignation has little or no virtue. Why get upset? Work it out.
Good for you. Short gainer. I think I learned a great deal from An Easy Burden, and I love the anecdotal approach. You really tell the story behind the scene. Did you write this yourself?
Pretty much.
How did you remember all this stuff?
Well, I started right after Dr. King's death. And okay. I went down, I was invited to give some lectures at the University of the West Indies. And I stayed down there a month. And in the course of giving the lectures, I recorded a lot, put a lot of stuff on tape. And I've reworked it 2 or 3 times since then. This is the final version that HarperCollins put together.
It's well, and so many, the ground crew, as you call.
Yeah.
I love, Andy, you dedicate this to the wives and moms of the people, of the civil rights workers, and I love that. And you've just lost your own dear wife of 40 years,
yeah.
Jean.
And it was, but it was a wonderful 40 years. And we had 4 children, all of whom are doing very well. And I was so used to being married and comfortable being married, I've since remarried.
Good for you.
I was not able to live alone.
That says a great deal about Jean, as well as your new wife.
Yes.
Good for you.
Well, they were both elementary school teachers. And my new wife is an elementary school teacher in Atlanta, about to retire. But she's been teaching in the same school for the last 20, 30 years.
She also underlined your favorite passages in the New Testament?
Well, she didn't, but she's Sunday school superintendent in a church. And
you're not getting away from this,
no,
Reverend.
Very, very, I tell you, for anybody to put up with me, they've got to be pretty religious and have a sense. My wife used to say, in fact, she and I counseled Arthur Ashe and his wife, and she told Arthur and Jeannie, she said, the only thing you can base a marriage on is forgiveness. Said, love will run out from time to time. She said, but you've always got to be forgiving.
That's wonderful.
And you have to have somebody of that spirit to make a relationship
Divine
work.
patience,
Yeah.
and especially while you're changing the world. One of the best insights, I was amazed that I know you're influenced by Jesus, the teaching of Jesus, and Mahatma Gandhi, but also Paul Tillich, or at least Martin Luther King was a Paul Tillich student.
Well, I tell you, all of us had to read Paul Tillich and Karl Barth and Reinhold Niebuhr. This was what we studied in seminary, and it was difficult to try to deal with that in the context of Gandhian nonviolence, because Paul Tillich and Reinhold Niebuhr were from the Christian realism and power politics. And I remember when we first went down to Georgia and I was running a voter registration drive, the Klan came to town. And we'd never seen the Klan until we announced a voter registration drive. And I had to figure that they were coming to get me. And we were in an old beat-up shack, where if you just threw a match on the front porch, it could go up in smoke. My daughter, who did the final editing of this book with me, Andrea, was just 3 months old. So I was in good Tillich and Niebuhr fashion. I told Gene, I said, look, if the Klan comes here, we're not going to wait for them. I'm going to go out and talk to them. I said, but I want you to sit up here in the window with a gun, and I want you to point it at the fellow that I identify as the leader. And so if they take me, you take him. And I said, if you have that kind of situation, I can negotiate with him from a position of strength. So,
That was your Christian realism.
that was my Christian realism. She went to Church of the Brethren school. And she said, no, I can't do that. I said, look, you can shoot. She was a country girl. We used to go shooting in the woods and things like that. I mean, she could hit a Coca-Cola bottle at 40, 50 yards. I said, you're a good shot. She said, yeah, but I would never point a gun at a human being. And I said, well, I mean, you're going to let them burn down our house, take your husband, kill your baby daughter? She said, look, you're the one that preaches all this stuff about cross and resurrection. She said, if you don't believe it, you ought not preach it. I said, good God Almighty, I married a crazy woman.
Who's in the pulpit now, honey?
But suddenly you come to think, you know, you might have to die for this stuff you're preaching. And Martin used to say all the time, if you haven't found something you're willing to die for, you're probably not fit to live anyway. But that's, I mean, that was the context in which we started out in the South. And it made it fairly easy to move in with Martin Luther King. But I had to make a transition from Christian realism to just basic Christian faith, that there would be crosses, but the cross is not the end. There's always a resurrection.
Beautiful. You got your share of comeuppance. You got beat up, but you saw a connection. You, Martin Luther King, Abernathy, you saw the connection with war, racism, war, poverty.
Yeah.
Hand in hand.
It's all connected.
And I think that's so critical. I think sometimes people, in a simplistic fashion, want to write it off as racism.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the problems we've got now, I think, are more poverty than racism. And for instance, in South Central Los Angeles, all the way back to the Watts riots, that really wasn't about race. That was about poverty.
I agree.
And now, I was reading in The Economist a few weeks ago that in every European country, the title page was, "What's the matter with men?" Well, what's the matter with men, and these are European men, is that the new jobs are all in the information age that don't require any heavy lifting. They require patience and study, and women are more adaptable to the new jobs than men. So every country in Europe has large numbers of men unemployed. They're beginning to increase their alcoholic rate. Their marriages are not working. And there's a crisis amongst men. Now, in America, we want to say that that's black men. But it's not black men. It's in the transition from the industrial age to the information age, men are having the most difficulty making the transition. Now, if we want to deal with it, let's deal with it as a transition from industrial age to information age, and not as something wrong with black people. Yeah. Or that the country is just totally racist. Now, that still doesn't eliminate the fact that there is racism, but you have to kind of de-racify poverty to deal with it. Yep. Because the militia, who are mostly white and ostensibly racist, are victims of poverty. Their children don't get good education. They don't have job security. They see the downsizing of industry moving their jobs away. And unfortunately, they blame it on blacks and burn down black churches rather than facing it as a problem of poverty. Out here in California, I think the confusion around affirmative action
wasn't that tragic? Yeah.
Was that, you know, we didn't have any problem with affirmative action in Atlanta for the Olympics. 40% of all of the construction we did was done by minority and female-owned companies. That was 40% of the $2 billion we raised. Now that was new money, that wasn't government money. But because we did that, it attracted another $5 billion of private investment that just flowed into Atlanta around the Olympics. And so everybody had enough work. Nobody complained. In fact, it even got to the point where we had so much work that they were busing Mexican Americans over from Texas, coming over every Sunday night, and working all week. And I remember going out to a job site and saying, did anybody check for green cards? And this good old South Georgia redneck, who normally would be isolationist, a good Pat Buchanan supporter, said to me, you better get the hell out of here. These guys are doing the job. If you want your Olympics finished on time, don't start any of that immigration crap.
There was a man in South Africa, I was teaching in Johannesburg, and he said, you Americans want to oversimplify everything. You love this racial identity. You think everything's black and white. He said, it's not black and white, it's gold and silver. That's the problem. The problem at its heart is
it's economic.
And poverty, and that's what moves.
And you see, just as in the early days of this movement, we had to demonstrate. I mean, people didn't think there was anything wrong with segregated lunch counters. They didn't think there was anything wrong with people in the back of the bus. We had to demonstrate, to define that as a moral issue, and then it became unacceptable. When Martin was killed, he was saying, we cannot allow a lonely island of poverty in the midst of this ocean of material wealth. And he was simply calling on America to address the question of poverty. And I think we're still there.
No question.
And
maybe worse.
Yeah, it is, because we've been in denial about poverty since 1968. And yet I think that this nation has the resources to give opportunity to all of our citizens. Nobody need be hungry and homeless in America. And we just have to figure out, and we have to realize that this is morally unacceptable. There's another story I tell about a kid in third grade. We got put out for playing in the back of the room with an ice pick. And we were sent to the principal's office, had to bring our parents back. I came back the same day because my mother and daddy were both working. My mother could take off whenever she wanted to. He never came back, and his mother never brought him back because she was a domestic worker, and domestic workers in New Orleans were making $1 a day plus car fare. And she couldn't take a day off from work to see about him. I was lifeguard at a swimming pool in that neighborhood just before my senior year in college. He came in and almost drowned. And I recognized him as somebody I knew, and he reminded me that we'd been put out of school together. He never had been back to school since third grade. He'd been in reform school, he'd been in and out of jail, he'd been in the state penitentiary, and he was a drug addict. But he sat there and he lectured me on why I was thinking about not going back to school, about taking time off, because I didn't know what I wanted to be. And he lectured me about why I had to get my education as quick as possible and get as much as I could get, and to help people like him. And the only thing I could think of was, there but for the grace of God go I. I mean, he was obviously as smart as me, maybe smarter. But because his parents were poor and mine were middle class, I had every chance and he had no chance. Now, we can correct things like that in America. We can give poor people who are very bright every chance. In fact, that's what's made America great through the years.
You actually make the point in your book, An Easy Burden, it costs 10 times more to send a kid to prison than it does to send him to college.
Much more.
Get a grip, America. I love the insights into some of the personalities that you were surrounded with, some of the egos. I mean, you humanize these guys, Abernathy, even Martin Luther King's humanity.
Because Martin was 26 years old when he started this. And we see him as a great prophet at the March on Washington saying, I have a dream. But the struggle for him to get there was really, it was a tremendous spiritual and internal battle. It was like Jacob wrestling with the angels every day of his life, because he knew everything he did could mean his death. And when he was stabbed, you know, in Harlem, to get the knife out of his chest, they had to carve a big cross in his chest and open up his chest to remove the knife because it was pressed against the main aorta of his heart. When he was sewed up, he still had the cross sewed in his chest. And he said, every morning when I brush my teeth, I have to face the cross. And I know this day might be my last. So, now that was from like 28. And the students would criticize him because he wouldn't come out and demonstrate with them. And he, you know, he took a lot of abuse for the positions that he took. He couldn't do enough for the young, and everything he did was too much for the elderly. And so trying to steer that narrow path of leadership that would keep everybody together, young and old, black and white, was a constant, you know, agony.
And he didn't sleep much, and he worried constantly, and he hated prison and small space.
And I think it's important for people to see him as a human being. I think kids ought to know he loved to play basketball. He grew up in the YMCA, and he played basketball, shot pool. Whenever we had time at home, we took our family swimming. You know, saints are people. And prophets have weaknesses and are weird.
Always. Saints, particularly. Andy, we're saying goodbye, but you have to tell me about...
This is the Cape Town, South Africa Olympic bid pin. And South Africa is bidding for the Olympics in 2004. And we're sort of trying to help them in Atlanta, because South Africa is another country that is taking on the problem of race and class and doing a wonderful job of it.
Yeah. Courageous and creative. In a word, what's the most important thing you learned about Andrew Young in writing An Easy Burden? In 10 seconds.
You know, I don't know. I didn't really know that I could ever get this together like this. And I guess if you can write a book, you can do almost anything.
Thanks for all you've done, for heaven's sake. And God bless you. Do something for heaven's sake. Change the world. Others.